What would you do if your HOA president showed up to your burning house, before the roof even collapsed? I never imagined I'd watch my own roof go up in flames, while the HOA stood there blaming me, like they knew what happened before the firefighters even arrived. But then the clues started falling into place. Midnight water drops, a fake inspector, and blueprints running straight across my land. And when I opened that fireproof box, I realized one thing. They never expected me to survive long enough to tell the truth. The first thing I remember is the sound. Not the sirens or the shouting, but the sharp crack of glass blowing out of my front windows one by one, like someone taking a hammer to every memory I'd nailed into those walls. Then the heat hit, thick and wrong, even from where I stood at the mouth of the gravel drive, boots planted in dust that glowed orange in the reflection. My cabin on Ridgewater Hill was burning to the ground. Flames poured out of the roof like something alive, licking into the Montana sky. Smoke climbed above the pines, dragging sparks into the wind. Fire trucks crowded the slope, red and white lights pulsing off the trunks. Hoses snaked across the dirt, spraying water that turned to steam as soon as it touched the siding. The air tasted like burned resin and wet ash. "Mr. Cole?" The voice cut through the noise, too crisp for a night like this. I didn't turn right away. I watched a firefighter drag a line across my front steps, boots pounding the boards my wife and I had sanded and stained until they shone. Those boards were black now, edges curling. "Remy." I looked. Bethany Reed, president of the Ridgewater Lakefront Association, stood under the wash of the engine lights like she was stepping up to a podium. Bright coral jacket, hair pulled back into a knot, leather folio hugged to her side. Her phone glowed in her free hand. Of all the people on this ridge, she was the last one I wanted to see tonight. "Bethany," I said, my voice rough from smoke. "You here to help carry hoses?" She didn't even pretend to laugh. Her mouth pressed into that tight line I'd seen at too many HOA meetings. "I'm here because this affects the entire community," she said. "The flames are visible from the south cul-de-sac. We've had half a dozen calls already. And frankly, Remy, there are questions." Embers drifted around her. Ash swirled into the rosebed by my gate. "What kind of questions?" I asked. Bethany looked past me at the cabin. "About how this started. About why there were no proper fire breaks up here. About whether your modifications might have created a hazard." There it was. Something in my chest burned hotter than the flames chewing through my roof. "Hazard," I repeated. "This place has been here longer than half your subdivision. Nothing up there changed yesterday." She tilted her head. "We both know that's not accurate, Remy. You've been, how shall I put it, stubborn about complying with our lakefront safety standards. Unauthorized fencing, non-compliant vegetation along the ridge. That old generator, ma'am." Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped between us, boots crunching on gravel. Ash dusted the brim of his hat. "Now's not the time," he said. "Let the fire crews work." Bethany gave him a quick smile. "Of course, Sheriff. I'm only trying to ensure everyone's safety. If this was accidental, we need to know. And if it wasn't..." She let the thought hang there with the smoke. I'd seen the way she looked at my ridge, the old barn, the dam, the strip of rocky slope the developers couldn't touch because my deed said otherwise. She didn't just like order. She liked ownership. "You think I burned my own place down?" I asked. Her gaze snapped back to me. "I think it would be irresponsible not to consider all possibilities," she said. "The association has noted multiple violations on your property in the past year. Concerns about fuel storage, that pile of old lumber by the barn that's also on fire," I said. "Funny how that works." Something flickered behind her eyes. She tapped her folio. Ridgewater's bylaws are very clear about combustible materials within 50 feet of any structure. I sent you 3 notices, Remy. You never responded. I had responded. Not to her, but to the county fire marshal, with inspection reports and photographs and my own stamped assessment. 20 years as a dam engineer teaches you how to quantify risk. They'd cleared me in writing. Bethany just hadn't liked their answer. A shout went up. "Roof's going!" The cabin gave a low groan. Flames burst higher, reflecting in Bethany's eyes. "This is exactly what we've been afraid of," she said, almost triumphant under the practiced concern. "One spark up here and the entire ridge is at risk. If this spreads down toward the lakefront properties—" "It isn't," I cut in. "Wind's taking it north. You can see that same as me." She ignored me, turning to Marcus. "Sheriff, the board will need a full investigation. We have liability to consider. If Mr. Cole's negligence caused this, the association will have no choice but to pursue legal action. Our residents are already asking whether their insurance rates will go up because of Bethany." Marcus's tone sharpened. "Not now. Fires don't just appear on cool nights with no lightning and no wind. I'd walked that property at dusk like I always do, checked the dam, listened to the creek spill into the holding pond, watched the lake catch the last light. Every gate latched, every pump reading normal. Too normal, in hindsight. I watched my front door collapse inward, sending up a curtain of sparks. Somewhere under that floor was a fireproof steel box bolted into the concrete, holding documents and drives I prayed were still intact. And scattered around the property, in places Bethany had called paranoid, were motion-triggered cameras. Bethany stepped closer, lowering her voice. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm glad you weren't inside when it started. This could have been so much worse. For everyone." "For everyone," I echoed. She gave me one last long look, then turned and walked back toward the row of SUVs behind the engines. Her taillights washed over the old metal sign on my gatepost. "Cole Ranch, Essator 1953. Marcus watched her go. "You all right, Remy?" "No," I said, "but I'm standing." He nodded. "State fire investigator will be up here at first light. We'll see what they can make of it." "They'll find what they're supposed to find," I murmured. Marcus frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I watched the way the fire moved along the siding. Not wild, not random. There were paths in it, patterns, energy going exactly where someone wanted it to go. "It means this wasn't an accident," I said quietly. "And I've got a feeling I know exactly who's going to be first in line to point a finger when the report comes in." My gaze followed the fading glow of Bethany's taillights as they disappeared down toward the lakefront gates she loved so much. Behind me, my cabin cracked and crashed inward, sending up another wave of sparks into the night. One question burned hotter than the rest. If Bethany Reed was truly worried about community safety, why had the president of the HOA been the first one to show up at my fire, accusations ready, before my roof had even finished collapsing? 6 months earlier, the ridge had been silent except for the wind moving through the lodge poles and the soft clink of my hammer against old cedar. Back then, the world hadn't smelled like smoke. It smelled like sawdust and lake water and the faint sweetness of the rose bushes my wife planted before the flood took her. The fence I was repairing wasn't just a fence. It was the last project we designed together. A simple 6-foot privacy rail of hand-cut planks, stained dark to blend with the hillside. She'd wanted a quiet spot where we could drink coffee above the lake, watching trout rise in the mornings. I'd finished setting the final post when a car door slammed behind me, the kind of slam that didn't belong on a ranch road. I wiped my palms on my jeans and turned. A silver SUV idled at the edge of my gravel pull-off, too clean for this mountain, chrome still shining despite the dirt track leading up here. Bethany Reed stepped out, wearing a bright coral jacket like she was arriving for a photo shoot rather than a conversation with a man still grieving. Behind her, a tall man in a neon vest held a clipboard and looked around like he was checking off boxes on a scavenger hunt. Bethany's smile was the tight, effortful kind, polite on the surface, irritated underneath. "Morning, Mr. Cole," she said, walking toward me like she owned the path she was standing on. "We received a report about an unapproved structure." I leaned on my hammer. "It's a fence, not a structure." "It's 6 feet 2 inches, she replied instantly, glancing back at the man behind her. He snapped the tape measure open with a metallic crack. "Our ridge front bylaws clearly state a maximum of 6. "That bylaw doesn't apply," I said calmly. "My land existed long before Ridgewater Lakefront HOA did. You can't govern property you don't control." Bethany lifted her chin. "We maintain certain standards around the lake. Views matter. Uniformity matters. Property values matter." I didn't say what I wanted to, that my wife's memory mattered more than any of those things. Instead, I pulled the laminated deed from my back pocket. It was weathered at the edges from the number of times I'd shown it to curious agents, hikers, and once an overeager developer who wanted to buy the entire ridge. "This is my boundary," I said, handing it to her. "Surveyed, recorded, confirmed." She barely glanced at it before giving it back. "The association has concerns," she said, waving vaguely toward the slope. "Several of our residents have raised issues about your improvements." "You mean the fence my wife designed?" I asked. Something in her expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe, or impatience, but it passed quickly. "We simply want compliance, Remy. Everyone else on the lake agrees to follow the rules." I looked past her to the shimmering water. New houses had gone up along the shoreline in the past. Vacation homes, all glass rails and metal roofs, belonging to people who didn't stay long enough to see the seasons turn. They wanted my ridge because they couldn't build any higher than the waterline. "Funny," I said quietly. "My wife and I didn't remember signing anything about Ridgewater Lakefront when we bought this place." Bethany took a slow breath, the kind people take when they're reminding themselves to stay professional. "Perhaps you didn't look carefully enough," she said. "The association is expanding. We have long-term plans to elevate this community." The man with the clipboard stepped behind her. "Ma'am, should I mark it for removal?" "No," I said before she could speak. "You're on my land. That tape is coming down." Bethany held up a manicured hand. "You can't threaten HOA personnel." "I didn't threaten anyone," I replied. "I told him not to trespass." For a moment, the ridge went quiet. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding across the gravel between us. Bethany cleared her throat. "You'll receive a formal notice within 72 hours. Please be advised that failing to respond could result in escalating fines." She turned, heels crunching on the crushed rock, but stopped halfway to her SUV. Without looking back, she added, "This fence, it interferes with community planning. And frankly, Remy, it doesn't fit the aesthetic we're trying to build." Then she was gone, tires spinning dust into the morning sunlight. The man in the vest hesitated, glancing between me and the retreating SUV. "Sorry," he said quietly. "I just get paid to measure things." He left too. I stood alone beside the fence, hands resting on the rail my wife had traced with her fingers the week before the floodwaters rose. The wind moved through the cedars again, carrying the scent of the lake below. Something wasn't right. My deed was ironclad. The county had no problem with my fence, and yet Bethany had arrived with paperwork and a fake inspector, trying to intimidate me into tearing down the only thing I'd built since my world collapsed. I reached down, picked up the dropped tape measure, and noticed a stamp along the side. Ridgewater Lakefront Expansion Project. Lot Development Surveying. expansion. They weren't interested in aesthetics. They were interested in land. My land. A cold feeling rippled down my spine. Bethany's words replayed in my head. Future community planning, elevating the community, interferes with expansion. They weren't trying to correct a violation. They were laying groundwork for something much bigger. And for the first time, I wondered, why would an HOA be drawing plans directly over a ridge they didn't own? The answer didn't come quickly. Not in words, anyway. It arrived a week later in the form of a thick, glossy envelope shoved so tightly into my mailbox that the metal flap bent at the corner. The Ridgewater Lakefront Association logo gleamed in silver ink at the top. Underneath, in bold letters, Notice of Community Non-Compliance. Inside were 3 separate violations. The first said my boat shed was unapproved. I didn't own a boat shed, just an old cedar lean-to that had been part of the ranch since the early 70s. The second claimed my livestock count exceeded ridgefront allowance. I had 4 cattle grazing that month. The ridgefront allowance, for the record, was 0, because it didn't apply to ridge properties outside HOA authority. The third one made my jaw tighten. Non-aesthetic rose garden. My wife's roses. The ones she planted at sunrise because she liked the way the first light hit the petals. I stood at the mailbox, the envelope trembling a little in my hand. The wind blew off the lake, cool and steady, carrying the sound of children laughing down by the new docks. Life was moving on for them. For me, it felt like the ridge was slowly tightening around my throat. By the 3rd week, the letters came daily. Illegal compost pile. Unsafe dam railing. Unauthorized vegetation line. Every morning I'd open the box and find another notice printed on heavy paper, all sharp corners and corporate fonts, like they were trying to bury me under expensive stationery. Each letter ended with the same line. Failure to respond may result in escalating fines and legal action. I didn't throw them away. I stacked them, neat as bricks, on the corner of my kitchen counter. I photographed every one. I logged the dates and times. Old engineer habits die hard. It was late afternoon when I got the knock on my door. I opened it to see Sheriff Marcus Hale standing on the porch, hat in hand, sun highlighting a dusting of silver in his beard. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't scowling either. Just resigned, like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. "Remy," he said, "mind if I come in?" I stepped aside. The sheriff wiped his boots on the mat and walked in slowly, eyes drifting over the living room. He knew what this cabin used to look like. The photographs on the mantel, the quilt my wife made draped over the back of the sofa. Those things were gone now, put away in storage after I realized looking at them every morning kept reopening wounds that hadn't closed yet. "I'm guessing this isn't a social call," I said. Marcus sighed and pulled out a folder so thick it strained the binder clips. "I've got complaints here. A lot of them, all filed by the HOA board." "How many is a lot?" 23, he said reluctantly. "In the past 19 days. I let out a slow exhale. "And you believe them?" "It's not about believing," he said. "I'm obligated to follow up." I walked to the window. From here, you could see the lake reflecting the ridge, patches of early snow lingering in the shadows. The houses near the shore shone like ornaments. My cabin, higher up, looked almost invisible against the tree line. "I know how this works," I said quietly. "You're getting pressure from down there." Marcus didn't deny it. "They're loud, they're organized, and they've got money. But I haven't forgotten who was here first." I turned. "Then what's this really about?" He hesitated. "There's talk," he said, "about developers poking around the lakefront again. Folks on the HOA board have been asking the county about expansion, zoning changes, property availability." My pulse ticked up. They think they can buy the ridge? Or condemn it, he said, if they can make it look unsafe. The room went still. Outside, the breeze rattled the dry grasses. A bluebird landed on the fence just beyond the porch, feathers bright against the fading day. Life going on, unaware of the quiet threat tightening around the ridge. I rubbed the back of my neck. So this, I gestured toward the folder. This isn't about compliance. No, Marcus said. I don't think it is. We stood in silence for a moment. I could hear the distant hum of a pickup on the gravel road, then the faint laughter of hikers down near the creek. Finally, I said, "Tell me what you need from me." "Cooperation," Marcus said softly, "and patience. I'm not here to hurt you, but I've got to check off the boxes." "You do what you have to do," I said, "and I'll keep doing what I'm doing." "Which is?" I met his eyes. "Documenting everything." He nodded approvingly. "Smart man." As he left, I stepped onto the porch, watching his truck disappear into the curve of the road. The sun was sliding behind the ridge, streaking the sky with gold and pale pink. My wife used to call it the ridge's quiet hour, when the world softened for a breath before nightfall. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table sorting the newest stack of violation letters, something shifted inside me. This wasn't random harassment. This wasn't strict rule enforcement. This was a strategy, a push, a patterned effort to weaken, corner, and pressure me until I gave up exactly what they wanted. My land. And as I ran my thumb over the embossed HOA seal at the top of the latest notice, one question rose above the rest. If they were willing to drown me in paperwork, what else were they willing to do? The answer came on a night when the sky felt too still, the kind of stillness that makes animals restless and ranch dogs pace the porch. A storm had been flirting with the ridge since sunset. Dark clouds stacking up over the western peaks, lightning flickering behind them, like someone striking matches in the distance. By midnight, the wind picked up, bending the top branches of the pines until they whispered to each other. I'd been checking the dam readings every evening, mostly out of habit. Engineering stays in your blood even when life tries to pull you in other directions. Tonight, though, something felt off before I even stepped outside. Maybe it was the air, heavy, damp, the way it gets when something is about to break. I grabbed my jacket, clicked on my headlamp, and followed the narrow trail down toward the lake. Needles and gravel crunched under my boots. The smell of rain was close. When I reached the dam overlook, I stopped so abruptly dust rose around my feet. The lake surface had dropped. Not by much, maybe 2-3 inches. But I knew that waterline the way some folks know the wrinkles on their own hands. It had dipped since sunset. That never happened on a cold night like this, not without a reason. I knelt near the concrete lip. Water trickled where it shouldn't. A low, metallic creak echoed from the far side of the dam, where the intake valves sat behind a locked gate. A locked gate I had checked myself just hours earlier. My pulse quickened. I swept the beam of my headlamp toward the ridge road leading to the HOA-maintained access trail. Fresh tire tracks cut through the soft mud, deep and distinct, pointing straight to my lower gate. No rancher I knew drove that way this late. No fisherman came up this far at night. And certainly no hiker would hop a locked barrier with a storm rolling in. I followed the tracks downhill until I reached the gate. The lock hung crooked, the latch scraped clean. Someone had forced it, quietly, crudely, but forced it all the same. The storm cracked overhead. A burst of cold rain slapped the back of my neck. I shoved the gate open and jogged the last stretch to the intake housing. The smell of metal and wet earth filled the air. My beam landed on the valve assembly, and my breath froze. The handle was halfway open, and there were boot prints in the mud. 2 sets. I crouched, fingertips brushing the wet ground. One pair small, maybe Bethany-sized small, but the other belonged to someone heavier. Someone who knew exactly where the valve controls were. I straightened slowly, rain dripping from my brow. Somebody had come up in the storm, crossed onto my land, tampered with the dam valves, and tried to make it look natural. If they'd opened it all the way, the sudden surge downstream could have damaged county pipes and flooded the lower trails. The HOA could have claimed unsafe infrastructure, blamed me, demanded intervention. Endanger the community water supply, I murmured. Bethany's last letter had used those same words. Thunder rolled across the ridge. Wind drove sheets of rain sideways as I shut the valve carefully, resetting it to its proper position. I checked the pressure gauges twice, hands steady even as my heart hammered against my ribs. That's when I noticed the faint red blink through the curtain of rain. The LED on one of my motion-triggered security cameras mounted under the pine eaves, it flashed steady, which meant someone had been here, recently. I wiped water from my eyes and trudged back toward the cabin. By the time I reached the porch, the storm had shifted east, leaving only a hard drizzle tapping against the metal roof. Inside, the cabin felt too warm, too quiet. I peeled off my jacket, water pooling on the mat, and went straight to the small monitor on my desk. The camera files loaded with a soft click. At 11:42 p.m., 2 figures appeared in the infrared glow, walking down the private HOA road, slipping through the trees toward my gate. One held a flashlight pointed at the ground. The other carried a short metal bar. They moved like people who'd done this before. My jaw tightened. The footage wasn't high resolution, but the colors were distinct enough under the infrared scrub. The smaller figure wore a jacket with reflective piping, HOA maintenance gear. The larger one wore a vest with a stitched logo on the chest. Though the rain blurred some details, the shapes were unmistakable. Contractor uniforms. I leaned closer. Minutes later, the camera at the dam valve caught them, one holding the bar against the latch, the other pulling the handle just enough to disrupt the water line, not enough to trigger full alarms. The smaller figure gestured toward the lake, agitated. The larger one shrugged, then pointed toward the ridge like they were discussing something unseen. Then they left. 5 minutes after they disappeared into the trees, the footage cut off, the storm knocking the camera offline. I sat back in my chair, the hum of the monitor filling the silence. A sudden drop in the lake level. Tire tracks from a private HOA road. Broken gate. Valve tampering. And then, at dawn, as I stood wiping the rain off my porch rail, an email arrived on my phone. Formal safety complaint. Water infrastructure. Hazard filed by Bethany Reed, timestamp, 4:17 a.m. I stared at the screen as the sky lightened behind the ridge, finally understanding the shape of the thing I was up against. This wasn't personal annoyance. This wasn't even greed. This was strategy, carefully crafted, quietly executed, perfectly timed, a setup, designed to paint me as a danger, designed to make my land look unfit, designed to push me off Ridgewater, one orchestrated accident at a time. The lake lay still below, the storm clouds pulling away to reveal a sliver of cold blue through the break. A solitary loon cried across the water, low and haunting. If they were willing to tamper with water infrastructure, what were they willing to do next? I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the security footage paused on my laptop. The frozen silhouettes of those 2 figures crouched near the valve controls. Rain tapped the metal roof until dawn, each drop sounding like a clock counting down to whatever came next. By morning, my coffee had gone cold twice. I stepped outside when the first light stretched across the ridge, casting a pale glow on the old dirt road leading to the highway. The air smelled like wet pine and damp earth, normally a comforting scent out here, but today it clung to me like a warning. I needed answers, and not the kind the HOA memos pretended to offer. I made my way down the ridge toward Walt Henderson's cabin, the old log place with the tin chimney and the wooden wind chime that clacked together like bones in the breeze. Walt had lived on this land longer than anyone, back when there were only 3 houses around the lake and no one had ever heard of a homeowners association. He was already on his porch when I arrived, pipe smoke curling into the crisp air. His old dog, Jasper, raised his head but didn't bother to get up. "Mornin'," Walt said. "You look like you fought the storm barehanded." "Close enough," I answered. "Got time?" He nodded slowly, tapping his pipe against the rail. "Always." I told him everything. The lowered water line, the broken gate, the security footage of the 2 figures at the valve, the safety complaint Bethany filed just hours later. Walt didn't interrupt once. He just stared toward the lake, jaw working the pipe stem like he was grinding down anger along with the tobacco. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "Damn shame it's come to this," he muttered. "But I can't say I'm surprised." "What do you mean?" Walt stood, joints cracking as he straightened. He walked to the porch railing and pointed his pipe stem toward the newer homes clustered along the south shore. Big windows reflecting the morning sun, driveways lined with ornamental grasses that didn't belong in Montana. "You see that row?" he asked. "Those folks didn't just move in, they moved people out." I frowned. "Who?" "Davis family first," he said. "They were fined so many times for lawn neglect and improper fence height, they finally sold at a loss. Left in the middle of the night with a moving truck. Then the Cortezes, remember them? He built those birdhouses your wife loved." "Yeah," I said quietly. "She still had one on her windowsill." "Well," Walt said, "HOA cited them for non-conforming exterior features. 700 in fines before they threw in the towel. Next thing you know, some developer put up a modern box with glass rails. Twice the size, half the charm." I felt something cold tighten in my gut. "And nobody fought it?" "Some tried," Walt said. "Single mother down the slope. Kira Thompson. HOA said her kid's chalk. Drawings on the driveway were graffiti. Can you believe that?" He shook his head. "Cost her $1,200 before she got tired and moved to Bozeman." The wind rustled the trees, scattering rainwater in shimmering drops. "This isn't random, Remy," Walt said. "They pick folks who they think can't fight back. Folks without deep pockets or loud lawyers. Folks who don't fit their vision. They push them until they break." "And now it's me," I said. Walt met my eyes. "Now it's you. Because you've got the ridge, and that ridge is the peace they need." The weight of his words settled on me. The fence, the violations, the fake inspector, the valve sabotage, all steps in the same direction, a plan with me standing dead center. I sank onto the porch railing, staring out over the mist rolling across the lake. "Walt, why didn't anyone say something? Why didn't you?" He looked down at his hands, scarred, weathered, scraped from decades of ranching. "Because back then I thought it was just bad luck, or people getting tired of mountain winters. But when they came after the Cortezes, and after Kira, I started putting the pieces together. And now you bring me this." The wind chimes clattered softly above us. Walt cleared his throat. "Listen, you're a good man, Remy. Your wife, God rest her, always said so. You've been quiet since she passed, but I know you've still got fight in you, and you'll need it." He walked to an old metal cabinet beside his porch and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were printed screenshots, copies of emails, old violation letters from neighbors, all saved like someone assembling a secret archive. "I've been collecting these," he said, "just in case." I flipped through the pages. Patterns emerged instantly. Similar wording and fines, repeated phrases, timestamps that correlated too neatly to board meetings. "They're methodical," I whispered. "Organized," Walt corrected. "And patient. But patience runs both ways." I tucked the envelope under my arm. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Walt said. "You're on their radar now. They won't like you asking questions." As if on cue, a truck rumbled up the road, white, with the HOA logo stamped on the side door. It stopped at the edge of Walt's driveway. A man in a reflective vest stepped out, holding a clipboard. "Morning," he called. "Routine check on community resources." Walt leaned in close. "Routine, my foot," he muttered. "They've never once done a routine check up here in 40 years. The man spotted me and stiffened slightly. "Oh, Mr. Cole. Didn't expect to see you." I glanced at the clipboard. Same type as the man from the fence inspection. Same reflective streak on the vest. My pulse kicked up. They were watching. Every move. Even here. Even now. As the truck drove off, Walt spat into the gravel. "Vultures," he grunted, "circling and circling." I clutched the envelope tighter, the paper edges biting into my palm. The harassment wasn't just beginning. It was escalating. And somewhere deep inside the HOA office, someone was pulling strings. Quiet, deliberate, relentless. A certified letter waited in my mailbox when I got home. "Urgent notice of emergency inspection to be conducted today at 3:00 p.m. Mandatory access required." My throat tightened. They weren't backing off. They were closing in. By the time the clock crept toward 3, the sky over Ridgewater had shifted into that pale, overcast gray that makes the mountains look like they're holding their breath. Cold air drifted down from the pines, carrying the scent of wet bark and lake water. I stood on my porch, hands in my pockets, watching the narrow road that twisted up from the subdivision. Right on schedule, a white truck with the HOA emblem rolled into view. The engine cut off, and a man climbed out, tall, wiry, with a neon vest and an official-looking clipboard. His boots were spotless, which told me he hadn't walked a ridge trail in his life. He glanced at the fence, then up at the cabin, eyes flicking from one spot to another, like he already had a list of violations prepared. "Afternoon, Mr. Cole," he called, stepping onto my property without waiting for a response. "I'm here for the emergency inspection." I leaned against the railing. "Funny how all your emergencies seem to happen only on my land." He gave a polite smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "We've received reports of multiple hazards. Our goal is resident safety." "Is that why someone broke my lock and tampered with my dam valve the other night?" I asked. His hand froze mid-sentence, fingers paused above his clipboard. For a tiny moment, color drained from his face, but he recovered fast. "I'm not aware of any such incident," he said. "Let's begin." He walked straight past me like he had every right in the world to be there. I followed, silent. The gravel crunched beneath our boots. A hawk screeched overhead, circling in wide, lazy arcs. The inspector headed to the barn first, taking dramatic photos of harmless things. A stack of lumber I'd milled last fall, a coil of hose, a bag of feed with the label torn. He knelt to photograph dirt on the barn door, zooming in like it was evidence. "You always this thorough?" I asked. "Standard procedure," he murmured. "No badge?" I asked. "No county authorization?" He straightened. "HOA inspections don't require those." "On HOA land," I corrected. "Not private property with a deed older than the HOA itself." He ignored that. Next, he made a beeline toward the lake pumps, walking faster now, like a man who already knew exactly what to film. He circled the equipment enclosure twice, muttering measurements to himself. Then he crouched and snapped pictures of the pipes. No actual issues, just moisture from last night's storm. Finally, He stopped at my fence, the same fence Bethany had declared non-compliant. He ran his tape measure along the boards, glancing occasionally at the HOA-issued binder tucked under his arm. "This exceeds the ridgefront height requirement," he announced. "Ridgefront regulations don't apply to unincorporated land," I said calmly. "But the county code does, and the county already cleared it." His jaw twitched. He wrote something anyway, pulled out my phone and hit record. "State your name, role, and authority for access." He blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Standard procedure." He swallowed, suddenly uncomfortable. "Daniel Farr, Ridgewater Compliance Advisor." "Working under whose authority?" "The Ridgewater Lakefront Association," he said. "President Reed, specifically." "Of course." "Got it all on video," I said. "Thanks." His lips pressed into a thin line. "You know, Mr. Cole, cooperation goes a long way. Documentation goes further." He didn't like that. His cheeks flushed as he walked back toward the driveway. "You'll receive a full report," he snapped. "Expect formal action." "Oh, I expect it," I said softly. "I expect all of it." He climbed into the truck and sped down the ridge. The moment his taillights vanished, I opened the folder Walt had given me and added today's footage to the stack. My heart thumped hard in my chest, but not from fear. Something sharper, more focused. When the wind shifted, the scent of damp pine gave way to a new smell, fresh coffee and gasoline, as a familiar red SUV turned up my drive. Sarah Mitchell stepped out with a leather satchel slung over one shoulder and the determined look of someone with answers. "Got here as fast as I could," she said. "We need to talk." She followed me inside, brushing snowmelt from her jacket sleeves. I poured her coffee, and she set the satchel on my table, flipping it open with a practiced motion. Inside were printed maps, highlighted documents, emails, and a set of HOA financial ledgers. Sarah leaned forward. "Remy, I found something big." I braced myself. "How big?" She slid a blueprint across the table. A development map, a marina, luxury homes, boat slips, community center, all drawn right over the ridge, my ridge. But that wasn't the worst part. In bold lettering, stamped across one corner, Phase 3, expansion upon safety clearance estimhust. Clearance date, TBD preferred access point, Cole property. My pulse hammered in my ears. So Walt was right. Sarah nodded grimly. "They've been planning this for years. And your cabin, your dam, your land, they're in the way." I stared at the blueprint, jaw tightening. "They want me gone." "They want your land made unsafe," she corrected. "Once that happens, the HOA can petition the county to intervene. If enough violations stack up, condemnation becomes an option." I exhaled slowly. "So all this, the complaints, the fake inspections, part of a coordinated paper trail." Sarah leaned back. "Which means we have leverage." I raised my brows. "How?" She pulled out one more document. An internal HOA memo, signed by Bethany, dated 3 weeks earlier. Subject line: Emergency funds reallocation, preliminary site risks. And then, beneath it, a line written in Bethany's own neat cursive. If Cole's Ridge cannot pass safety, review, we proceed with planned acquisition. I sat there, the cabin silent around us, except for the soft creak of wood settling as the storm clouds fully broke apart above the mountain. Sarah watched my face. "You ready for the bad part?" "I doubt there's a good one." She took a breath. "The man who inspected your place today? He's not licensed. His certification expired 8 years ago. He's been paid directly from HOA discretionary funds." I ran a hand down my face. "So they're building a false case." "They're building a trap," she said, "piece by piece. And I'm afraid today's inspection is just the beginning. The weight of her words pressed into the cabin like a storm that hadn't yet hit. What do I do? I asked quietly. Sarah closed the folder, her eyes steady. You document. You stay patient. And you don't confront them. The more rope they think they have, the more they tie around themselves. Outside, the lake glimmered beneath the thinning clouds. The ridge was quiet. Too quiet. And for the first time since this started, I understood exactly what kind of game Bethany Reed was playing. The kind that didn't stop at letters. The kind that didn't stop at sabotage. The kind that only ended when the last piece of land was taken, or when someone pushed back. 2 days after the fake inspection, the ridge settled into a deceptive calm. The sky cleared to a cold, bright blue that made the lake sparkle like a sheet of hammered steel. Most folks in Ridgewater would have called it a perfect fall morning. For me, it felt like the quiet just before a dynamite charge goes off in a mine shaft. Sarah arrived early, boots crunching over frost as she crossed my porch with the same leather satchel she'd brought before. Her breath clouded in the air, and her eyes told me she'd been up late. I found more, she said, without even waiting for coffee. A lot more. I stepped back to let her in. The stove hummed softly, warming the cabin. She laid the satchel on the table and pulled out a roll of documents secured with a red rubber band. When she unfurled them, the paper crackled like brittle leaves. At first I thought they were just zoning maps, but the more I looked, the more the details sharpened. Paths, grids, parcel splits, elevation notes, utility lines. These are development plans, I murmured. Sarah nodded. Not proposals, plans. The largest sheet showed the lake centered like a jewel, with new roads branching like veins from the shoreline. I traced the southern edge with my finger, past the luxury homes and down toward the slopes. Then my finger hit the ridge, my ridge, and stopped. There, stamped in blue, were 4 words that made my stomach drop. Phase 3, Marina Expansion, directly over my cabin. What is this? I asked, barely keeping my voice level. Blueprints obtained from a planning consultant, Sarah said. A consultant hired by the HOA board under their community improvement budget. I leaned closer. The expansion area wasn't small. It swallowed my land whole, from the fence line down to the dam spillway, and all the way across the ridge where my cattle sometimes grazed. They can't do this, I whispered. Not legally, Sarah agreed, but they're not planning to do it legally. The paper rustled as she pulled out another sheet. This one a copy of an internal HOA email chain. The headers read like a slow-burning fuse. From Be Read to HOA Board subject, Ridgewater Future Vision Initiative. Lines of text marched down the page. Coles Ridge remains a critical barrier. Unsafe structures may justify intervention. We must document hazards before expansion contracts proceed. I felt heat rise in my chest. Expansion contracts. Sarah tapped the page. Already drafted with a private developer out of Spokane. The HOA is planning to sell access rights to your ridge once they clear it through a safety action. I sank into a chair. The wooden seat creaked under my weight. There was still more. Sarah took out a final document, a thin, printed insurance form with Bethany's signature at the bottom. A chill crawled up my spine long before Sarah explained it. That, she said quietly, is Bethany's preliminary claim for fire damage, filed with her insurance provider 2 weeks ago. I blinked. 2 weeks ago? She nodded. Yes. It cites potential damage from a projected fire event originating near the ridge, specifically from your property. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The cabin seemed to tilt slightly, like the ground wasn't steady anymore. Through the window, sunlight glinted off the lake. Too bright, too sharp. They predicted a fire, I said slowly. Or planned one, Sarah replied. I stood, moving to the window. The ridge stretched below like a living map, pines swaying gently, the creek snaking toward the lake, my fence casting a long shadow on the morning frost. And somewhere down there, buried in mud and pine needles, were the prints of the two people who had tampered with the dam valves just nights before. The puzzle pieces clicked together with a sickening clarity. The letters, the fake inspector, the sabotage, the safety complaint, the development plans hovering like vultures over my deed. And now, an insurance claim filed before anything had happened. They weren't waiting for a fire. They were counting on one. I turned back to Sarah. Why me? Why my land? Why all this? She folded her hands on the table. Because your ridge is the last piece. Without it, the marina expansion dies. The developer walks, and the HOA loses the biggest financial deal they've ever courted. The air felt colder. So they decided to force me off my own property. She nodded. Safest way for them is to make it look like you're the hazard. Enough violations, enough emergencies, enough accusations, and they can claim it's a community risk. And if a fire did happen, I said, they'd say it proved their point, Sarah finished. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the ticking of the stove, expanding with the heat. I forced myself to breathe, slowly, in and out. Finally, I said, we need to stop them. Sarah leaned back, offering the smallest of smiles. Already on it. I've filed public record requests for all HOA budgets from the past 5 years. There are discrepancies, payments that don't match their meeting logs. Someone's been funneling money. Fraud, I murmured. Potentially, she said. But it's early. What we do know, she tapped the blueprints, the emails, the insurance form, is that these people aren't just overreaching, they're orchestrating. I walked to the old metal cabinet beside the fireplace and pulled out my security backup drives, the ones my wife insisted we install after a trespassing incident years back. I set them beside the growing stack of evidence on the table. I want to set a trap, I said quietly. Sarah raised a brow. What kind of trap? The kind where they think I'm not paying attention, I said. The kind where they show their hand. The kind they walk into all but dong themselves. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. All right, but whatever you're thinking, remember, you need to stay within the law. Let them be the ones who cross the line. They've already crossed it, I said. I just need to make sure everyone else can see it. Outside, a truck engine growled somewhere down the ridge, too far to make out, but close enough to remind me I wasn't alone out here. Not anymore. I closed the blueprint, pressing the pages flat with both hands. They want a fire, I murmured. They want a story that makes me the villain. Sarah met my gaze. Then give them the story they don't expect. I nodded slowly. A storm was building again. Not in the sky this time. In me. By the night my cabin burned, that storm had grown into something steady and cold, like the pressure behind a dam right before the spillways open. I didn't know exactly when the fire started. I only knew that the smell of smoke reached me before the first siren, drifting up the ridge in thin, bitter threads that didn't belong to any wood stove or brush pile. When I stepped out onto the porch, the world was glowing orange. Flames leapt from the cabin roof like wild creatures freed from a cage. Sparks swirled into the wind, carried toward the treetops in bright, frantic spirals. I ran, boots pounding the hard-packed dirt, heart slamming in my chest. Heat washed over me, too fierce, too sudden. Fire like that didn't come from a faulty wire or a forgotten ember. It came from intention. By the time the fire crews arrived, the cabin was already collapsing in on itself. The old beams cracked like rifle shots. Smoke roared from the windows, thick enough to sting my eyes even from the yard. I stood there, helpless, feeling 40 years of history, mine and my wife's, curl into blackened scraps. After everything we'd survived together, it was the fire that took what was left. The ridge blurred for a moment. Whether from heat or memory, I couldn't tell. Neighbors gathered below the drive, drawn by the glow. A few whispered my name, sympathy in their voices. Others whispered another word, suspicious, and shot uneasy glances toward the lakefront, where HOA members lived in neat, modern rows. Through the chaos, a firefighter jogged toward me, protective gear streaked with soot. "Sir, we found your fireproof lockbox," he said. "It's intact. We pulled it from under a collapsed beam." My breath caught. The lockbox. The one installed before my wife passed. The one holding my documents, my footage, my proof. He handed it over, metal still warm. I took it carefully. "Thank you." He nodded once, then turned back toward the blaze. With shaking hands, I carried the box away from the heat, down to the old workbench by the shed. The firefighters were shouting orders behind me, hoses hissing, embers popping. I tuned it all out. The lock clicked open. Inside lay two things that mattered more than anything else on that ridge: a folder of my special deed copies and my micro SD backup drives. I exhaled slowly, chest tight. If anything could expose what had been done to me, it was inside those drives. I slid one into my laptop and waited as the screen flickered to life. Footage loaded. Static at first. Then motion. At 1:08 a.m., two figures emerged at the bottom edge of the ridge, moving with calculated precision. They carried something between them, a container I recognized instantly, a fuel canister, the industrial kind often used for equipment. My stomach dropped. They didn't approach the cabin right away. Instead, they walked to the barn, pouring thin lines along the base. Then they did the same along the generator shed. Finally, they approached the cabin itself, circling it with a steady, practiced rhythm. I recognized the smaller figure's posture, the stiff, narrow stance, the sharp way she pointed toward the railings like a manager directing her staff. Bethany. Even through grainy infrared, I'd know that silhouette anywhere. A burst of rage pricked the back of my eyes, but I forced myself to stay still, to keep watching. The larger figure crouched near the generator, hooking something metallic to the side. When he stepped back, I saw the faint glint of a propane trigger rig, designed to ignite the moment the generator flipped on during a voltage dip. Intentional, engineered, calculated. Bethany stepped back to admire their work. Yes, that was the right word, then gestured briskly toward the path. The two of them retreated downhill, merging into the shadowed pines. 5 minutes later, another camera picked up a different angle of Bethany returning alone, walking quickly, phone held to her ear. The fire started behind her as she reached the bend in the road. In the video, she didn't even flinch. She didn't turn once. She kept walking. Then, this part made my skin crawl. She shook out her hair, squared her shoulders, slowed her pace, and walked toward the distant glow with an expression of perfectly staged concern. I sat in silence, breath short, fingers numb around the edge of the table. This wasn't carelessness. It wasn't a mistake. This was arson, planned and executed. And then, like salt rubbed into a burn, the file timestamp showed something I hadn't expected. Bethany checked her phone at 1:17 a.m., 10 minutes before the fire bloomed. But her insurance claim, filed 2 weeks earlier, predicted potential damage from an anticipated blaze. 2 weeks. I closed the laptop. The fire cracked behind me, a beam collapsing in a shower of sparks. The night air vibrated with the noise, with the engine sirens. with the roar of flames trying to eat the last of what I'd built. And above it all, I heard her voice again, Bethany, asking the sheriff at the scene if my negligence had caused the fire. I tightened my grip on the laptop. "Not negligence," I whispered. "Not this time." My phone buzzed on the bench, vibrating against the metal. "Sheriff Hale," I answered. "Yeah, Marcus?" "Remy." His voice was tired, strained. "I've got questions I'm supposed to ask you. HOA's already sending emails." "Marcus," I said quietly, "you need to come back up here." "Why?" "Because I have footage." A beat of silence. "What kind of footage?" he asked. "The kind you bring a warrant for." He breathed out sharply. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Make it 10. Rain began falling again, light but steady, hissing against the hot debris. I stood there watching steam rise from the ash, my wife's roses glowing faintly in the firelight, untouched by the flames. A strange mercy in a night full of cruelty as the first drops soaked into the charred earth. The ridge seemed to whisper a single truth. They thought they'd burned away the evidence. But the fire had done the opposite. It had lit everything up. A week later, the ashes of my cabin were still cold, but the courtroom on the mountain was burning with something else entirely. Anticipation. Word had spread across Ridgewater and beyond. The parking lot outside the old log courthouse filled before sunrise, engines rumbling in the cold as folks lined up in heavy coats, hands wrapped around thermoses, whispering about the fire on the ridge and the HOA president bold enough to file a complaint before the embers cooled. Inside, sunlight streamed through tall windows, hitting the polished wooden benches and the high-beamed ceiling. The place smelled like pine and old paper, the scent you get when justice has been practiced in the same room for generations. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Sarah Mitchell. She wore a charcoal suit, her jaw tight with focus, her satchel at her feet like a loaded weapon. Behind us, the state fire investigator, the county water commission rep, even Sheriff Marcus Hale, all present, all stone-faced. But when the heavy courthouse doors creaked open, all heads turned. Bethany Reed walked in like she was attending a board meeting, not a hearing. Coral blazer, hair perfect, expression carefully arranged somewhere between concern and superiority. A few HOA board members trailed behind her, whispering fast, their eyes darting across the room like cornered animals. Bethany slowed when she saw me. Her face tightened. Surprise, maybe even irritation, when she took in the people seated behind me. Not just mountain locals, state officials, investigators, neighbors she'd driven out. Then she spotted the fireproof lockbox sitting on the table before me. Her lips parted ever so slightly, a tremor of recognition. I held her gaze until she looked away. The bailiff called the room to order. Papers shuffled. Chairs creaked. Then Judge Rowena Clark entered, the kind of judge who didn't need a gavel to command silence. Her eyes swept the room sharp as winter wind. "We're here," she said, "to review the circumstances surrounding the fire at the Cole property and the subsequent claims and complaints submitted by the Ridgewater Lakefront Association." Bethany's attorney, a nervous man with sweaty hands, stood first. "Your Honor," he began, "my client is here voluntarily. She is concerned for community safety." Sarah rose before he could finish. "Your Honor, the plaintiff is prepared to present evidence that the HOA's concern began only when it served their financial interest." The judge nodded. "Show me." Sarah didn't waste time. She stepped forward, projector remote in hand, and with a soft click, the first footage appeared on the courtroom screen. The grainy but unmistakable infrared image of two figures approaching my dam valve. A murmur rippled through the room. Sheriff Hale shifted in his seat. Bethany's fingers curled around the edge of her folio. Sarah narrated calmly, This was recorded 3 nights prior to the fire. These individuals accessed Mr. Cole's private property without permission and tampered with municipal-connected water infrastructure. Mr. Cole's gate was damaged. The intake valve was partially opened, which lowered the lake level. The judge's brow furrowed. Is that confirmed? Confirmed by both the County Water Commission and state hydrology reports, Sarah replied. And it directly contradicts the safety complaint filed by Ms. Reed only hours later. Sarah clicked again. The next video played. The propane trigger rig, the accelerant lines around the barn, the figures moving in the dark. And finally, Bethany's unmistakable silhouette walking toward the ridge road, head turned away from the glow beginning behind her. Bethany's attorney stumbled to his feet. Your Honor, this could be low resolution. Sarah cut in cleanly. Then perhaps these will help. She placed printed still frames on the evidence podium. The room leaned forward. Even from a distance, the shapes were clear. But the final blow wasn't the footage. It was the document Sarah laid beside it. A printed insurance form stamped with a date. Your Honor, Sarah said softly, this is Ms. Reed's insurance claim, filed 2 weeks before the fire, claiming projected damage from a blaze originating on the coal ridge. She paused. A blaze that hadn't happened yet. Silence fell heavy, thick, then chaos. Reporters scribbled, neighbors gasped. Even the judge looked momentarily stunned. Bethany shot to her feet. This is outrageous. Those are fabrications. He's manipulating footage. This entire thing is a vendetta. Her voice cracked on the last word. Judge Clark raised a hand, and the room quieted instantly. Miss Reed, she said, you may respond, but I advise caution. Bethany glared at me, fury burning behind her polished exterior. He's lying. He's always been hostile. He refused to comply with even the simplest community standards. He put us all at risk. He endangered the lake. Miss Reed, the judge said sharply, address the evidence. Bethany swallowed. Her attorney tugged her sleeve. Don't, he whispered. But Bethany pressed forward anyway, voice rising. We would never do something like this. If there was a fire, it was because his property was already unsafe. He had illegal equipment, dangerous structures, flammable materials. That was her mistake. Sarah stepped forward, lifting the final piece of evidence. Your Honor, if I may? Judge Clark nodded. This, Sarah said, is the county inspector's report from 4 months ago. It confirms that Mr. Cole's property passed every fire safety requirement. And this, she held up another sheet, is the fire investigator's analysis of the blaze. It states that the ignition point originated from professionally placed accelerants, inconsistent with any natural or accidental cause. Her words hung in the air like a dropped match. Bethany's eyes widened, just slightly, before her mouth snapped shut. A beat. Then Judge Clark spoke, her tone cold as ice on the lake in January. Ms. Reed, she said, you entered this courtroom accusing Mr. Cole of negligence. What I see here suggests something very different. Bethany's attorney sank into his seat. Based on this evidence, the judge continued, I am authorizing a full criminal investigation into the actions of the Ridgewater Lakefront Association, including, but not limited to, insurance fraud, trespassing, tampering with public water infrastructure, and willful property destruction. Gasps spread through the room. And until further notice, Judge Clark added, hammering the words like nails, all HOA enforcement powers related to Mr. Cole's property are suspended. Bethany's face drained of color. The judge turned her gaze toward her. Ms. Reed, do you have anything else you'd like to add to the record? Bethany opened her mouth, but nothing came out. The silence said more than any defense she could have offered. Behind me, Walt let out a quiet breath. the kind that carried years of frustration finally easing. Sheriff Hale rubbed his jaw, looking both tired and vindicated. The fire investigator jotted notes, his expression grim. As the hearing adjourned, Bethany swayed slightly, gripping her folio like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She glared at me with a hatred so sharp it might have cut through stone. "This isn't over," she hissed. I stood, meeting her stare without flinching. "The fire wasn't supposed to be either," I said. But the truth had survived, just like the lockbox. And now the mountain carried the story, not her version of it. The week that followed felt different. Not quieter exactly, but calmer in that way a forest feels after a lightning strike has passed, and only the smell of char remains. The ridge held its breath. Neighbors watched the road. Even the wind moved a little slower through the pines, brushing over blackened beams and cold ash, as if taking measure of what had happened. State investigators worked fast. By Friday morning, 3 unmarked vehicles wound their way up the subdivision road, tires crunching on frost. Agents stepped out with clipboards, cameras, sealed evidence envelopes. And for the first time since this ordeal began, I saw something flicker in the HOA board members' faces that hadn't been there before. Fear. Not irritation, not annoyance, not smug certainty. Fear. The kind people feel when the story they wrote for everyone else suddenly turns on them. Bethany tried to maintain her usual poise, coral blazer, hair perfect, lips pressed into a diplomatic line. But even from my porch, I could see the tremor in her hands as she unlocked the HOA office for investigators. She kept glancing toward the ridge, as if the burned outline of my cabin haunted her peripheral vision. Maybe it did. By noon, Sheriff Hale drove up to my temporary trailer, his expression somewhere between exhausted and relieved. He stepped out of his cruiser, hat tucked under his arm. "It's happening," he said. "What is?" "Everything." He exhaled hard. "The state's filing charges, multiple ones, and not just against Bethany." I leaned against the railing. "Who else?" "2 board members, the treasurer, the contractor who tampered with your valves, and," he hesitated, "the guy who staged that inspection." I nodded slowly. They were all in on it. He didn't deny it. Evidence trail makes it clear as day. Sarah joined us minutes later, folders in hand, wearing that quiet, razor-sharp look lawyers get when the tide finally turns in the right direction. "The state is moving quickly," she said. "Arson, infrastructure tampering, property destruction, insurance fraud, conspiracy. It's going to be a long list." "And Ridgewater?" I asked. "The HOA will be suspended under emergency supervision," she replied. "Their funds frozen, their powers revoked. A forensic audit begins Monday." I let the words sink into the cold mountain air. Somewhere down the slope, birds flitted over frost-tipped grass, and the lake shimmered beneath the pale afternoon sun. Still standing, still mine. It wasn't joy I felt, not revenge, just release. A quiet untying of a knot I'd been carrying in my chest for months. Late that evening, as shadows stretched long across the ridge, a convoy of vehicles headed toward the lakefront. Blue and red lights flickered across the water. Folks gathered in driveways, wrapped in jackets, whispering. The wind carried their murmurs up to me. "They're arresting her." "It's about time. Lord above, she burned that man's house. Did you see the footage? Never thought the HOA would fall like this. When the officers led Bethany out of her immaculate home, she didn't fight, didn't scream, didn't deny it. She looked out toward the dark ridge where my cabin used to stand, expression unreadable through the glare of headlines and camera flashes. For a moment, she wasn't the HOA president. She wasn't the mastermind of some paper-driven, carefully orchestrated takeover. She was just a person who'd finally run out of ways to dodge the truth. I didn't go down to watch. There was no satisfaction for me in handcuffs or flashing lights. Instead, I stayed on the ridge, hands in my pockets, listening as the engines faded down the mountain road toward town. Later, under a sky clear enough to see every star above the timberline, I walked to the edge of the lake. The water lapped gently against the rocks, carrying the moonlight in ripples. A few charred boards from my cabin were stacked neatly nearby, courtesy of the fire crew, remnants that would be recycled into the new build once construction began. A federal grant for fire victims and the soon-to-be awarded restitution would help rebuild faster than I'd expected. I crouched, dipped my fingers into the cold lake, and whispered into the night. "We'll rebuild it right this time." As if in response, a trout broke the surface, the splash echoing softly. The next morning, Walt showed up with 2 thermoses and a grin that belonged on a man 20 years younger. "Heard they're naming a new policy after you," he said. "Ridgewater Property Protection Act." "Catchy," I replied. "Damn right it is." He handed me a thermos. "Protects landowners from HOA overreach. Makes any existing deed senior to any new bylaws. Requires state oversight if harassment complaints pile up." I nodded slowly. "Good. Folks around here deserve it." Walt clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You deserve the peace, son." Peace. It didn't come all at once, but it came, like slow morning light moving across the mountains, warming what the fire hadn't been able to take. Over the next few months, volunteers helped me rebuild the cabin frame. Neighbors dropped off food and lumber. The county offered grants. The lakefront residents who once kept their distance now stopped by with genuine apologies, shaken by how deeply they'd been misled. Sarah visited often, bringing updates from court, each one steadier than the last. By spring, construction on the marina expansion had been halted permanently. Developers backed out. Ridgewater HOA was dissolved under state order. The ridge stayed mine. The lake stayed whole, and the mountain kept its quiet dignity. On the morning we raised the final beam of the new cabin, I stood on the deck overlooking the lake. The sunrise painted the water gold. Birds flitted between the pines. A breeze carried the soft scent of sap and sawdust. For the first time in a long time, I felt steady, whole. Behind me, Sarah stepped through the doorway, smiling faintly. "Looks like home again." "It will be," I said. "Soon." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the ripples across the lake. Finally, I spoke, not loudly, not triumphantly, just honestly. "You can burn a house," I said, "but you can't burn the truth." The lake stayed quiet, as if it agreed. If you've ever stood your ground against someone who thought they could push you off your own land, drop a yes in the comments, or just leave a justice if you know what it feels like to fight for what's right. Stories like this remind us that truth may bend, but it never breaks. And if you'd like to ride along for more HOA showdowns and ranch-side justice, go ahead and subscribe. I'd be glad to have you here for the next one.